And it's time for the first of our keynote speakers. Now, in horse racing, we're coming accustomed to the ethics underpinning the horse and rider relationship and how that's being questioned by the outside world, often who aren't necessarily familiar with horses and racing. In future, we must aim to sort of conduct our activities with a transparency and accountability and in an evidence-based way to secure its future. So I'm just going to introduce Roly Owers, Executive of World Horse Welfare, to tell us more about racing's social licence and how we're going to navigate the coming years.
Addy, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. It's not my normal audience to come and speak, but by training I'm a vet, and all I can say is I went to Future Champions Day at Newmarket last week, and I gave £50 to the tote, and I didn't ask for anything back either, and I didn't get anything back. So why should an incompetent gambler and someone who's trained as a vet be coming to speak to you today? Well, I come to speak to you, as Maddie says, as someone who works for World Horse Welfare and have done so for the last 14 years. So I just wanted to very briefly introduce the work of the organisation and why it's relevant for me to speak today. Then to introduce very briefly racing's problem, but it's certainly not just racing's problem, it's horse sport's problem. But for those of you who know me will know I'm a real optimist, and when you do a SWOT analysis, to every threat there's an opportunity. And so I do think there's a real opportunity here as well. So then just want to introduce the concept of social licence if you're not aware of it, and then just to talk that through about how that can be used to maintain a very successful and buoyant future for horse racing. So, World Horse Welfare, a charity that was founded almost 100 years ago, and at our heart is to have a pragmatic but caring attitude and approach to equine welfare. And in that, we support the horse-human partnership in all of its guises. So when we look around the world today, we obviously use the horse as a sporting animal, but it's mainly used as a leisure animal, even more so as a working animal, but also an animal for therapy, an animal for food, and a growing array of other uses around the world. And at heart, World Horse Welfare believes that's fine. We can use horses in these ways as long as we do so responsibly. And so central to our work globally is to work in partnership. So whether that we with the British Horse Council in the UK or with the European Horse Network, which we work with Florence from an EU and European perspective, or for the World Federation for Animals. So that's what World Horse Welfare is all about. But of course, the main focus of today is around horse sport and what we mean by responsible horse sport. And in that regard, we have had, for over 30 years, we've been welfare advisors to the International Equestrian Federation, the FEI, but also have been welfare advisors, along with the RSPCA, to the British Horse Racing, and a growing number of other federations informally around the world too. And most recently, I had the joy of being on British Racing's Whip Review Steering Group, which reported earlier this year. So I hope that gives a focus of a feel for what World Horse Welfare is all about. And for the past 5 or so years, a growing focus for us has been around what we mean about responsible horse sport. And it very quickly came to being this concept of social licence, which I'll talk about more in a second. And over the summer, we recently published a scientific paper about looking at the concept of social licence, but it's not something that's just relevant to equestrianism, it's relevant to so many other industries. And so this paper looked at what we can learn from other industries as we seek to grapple with the challenge of social licence. So what do I mean by racing's problem? Well, instances of poor welfare in equestrianism have a negative effect on public opinion and within the horse world itself. And it's really important to recognise that in the day and age that we live now, what happens in one sport can have a real negative impact on another. Because as far as the public concerned, it doesn't really matter whether it's dressage, polo, racing, or any other discipline. They see it as horses and humans interacting for fun. And of course, in the world of social media, what happens in one part of the world can be global headlines very, very shortly very shortly afterwards. So we all need to conduct ourselves and our sports in a way that are ethically acceptable, both in the field of play and, of course, as importantly, if not more importantly, away from the field of play as well. The ethics underpinning the horse-human partnership, especially in sport and entertainment, are increasingly being questioned by the general public, many of whom, of course, are unfamiliar with horses. Riding for us is a partnership, but for many, it's an exploitation and even abuse. But it's also important to recognise this is not just the general public out there, because there are a growing cadre of people who are within the horse world who are increasingly critical of elements of traditional horsemanship and practices and the questions of sport. So society is changing, and as I'll mention later, our understanding of equine welfare is changing. So to have a successful future, we need to change with it. And that's where the concept of social licence comes into play. What is social licence? It's an unwritten contract between society and those who pursue an activity, obviously in our regard, horse racing. It's got nothing to do with the law. The concept originated in the mining industry in the 1990s and now is adapted across many other industries, including other animal use activities, equestrian sport, and gambling. And what it means is it represents an ongoing acceptance of the public and of society in what we do. And the state of an industry or a sports social licence can define its future, whether on one hand it can operate with minimal formalised restrictions, or on the other there can be restrictive legislation or indeed bans. So what are the consequences? Can you really lose one's social licence? We would say absolutely yes. You only have to look at greyhound racing, which is banned in many states in Australia and the US, and is indeed now under threat here in the UK. Jump racing has been banned in most states of the US. Equestrianism has been lost from modern pentathlon after the Paris Olympics. And animal welfare concerns underpin the loss of many of these sports. So it does really show that the threat is real and it is here now. And it's key to recognise that everyone involved in equestrian sport, jockey, trainer, owner, whoever, organisations and individuals control the balance of our social licence. And our collective actions will determine whether or not it will reach a dangerous kicking point. So, how is social licence lost? Well, this loss is generally insidious. It may go unnoticed until a situation is actually quite difficult to retrieve. Typically, it moves through a series of phases, from negative portrayal in the media to restrictive legislation or an outright ban. And if racing reaches a point where industry is no longer trusted to do right by our horses, the social licence slope will get ever slippier. The introduction of the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority in the US is an example of revised legislation, and the ban on jumps racing in parts of Australia is an example of a regulatory ban. So racing has already lost its social licence in some jurisdictions. But of course, of key relevance to today is what impact does this have on betting? And it's fair to say that there isn't a whole heap of data to show what the public perception is of racing on betting turnover. But what there is does raise some questions. In 2017, a YouGov poll in the UK found that 32% of online gamblers thought that the Grand National was cruel. The opinions of the betting public have also been investigated by ATG through a survey of their customers, and both Peter Johansson at ATG and Craig Fravel from the Stronach Group discussed this in WoTA's June webinar on the impact of race rules on betting. Both suggested that welfare issues and or bad press about horse welfare deter a proportion of punters from betting. And Petter also pointed out that young people are more concerned than the older generation about corporate social responsibility and animal welfare. So this does sort of sound a warning bell for what the impact will be on betting in the future. So maintaining racing's social license, it's actually difficult. If you want to do something about something, then you want to know where you are now. And it's actually quite difficult to be sure where we are on the social license barometer for racing. So to a large extent, we know that it will be, as I've already said, jurisdiction dependent and discipline dependent. But safe to say, it's not as high as it used to be. We would all like it to be within the acceptance range or even in the approval range. But how can we achieve that? So, I think it's important to recognise at this stage that racing is not going from a standing start. It has been proactive, and this is from across the world. In the past decade or so, longer in some jurisdictions, racing authorities around the world have been working hard to improve equine welfare, and with it, the sports social licence. From the launch of the Horse Welfare Board in the UK and the Hong Kong Jockey Club's Equine Welfare Research Foundation, to the establishment of injury surveillance databases, to preventative checks on race day and in training. So this is exactly what racing needs to do and continue to do to maintain your social licence. But what more can be done? Because for sure, as I said, with a society changing values and our understanding of equine welfare changing all the time, more can always be done. And it's important to recognise that the social licence is more than just looking after equine welfare, as important as this is. It also includes consideration of ethics, education, communication, and taking a proactive approach to potential problems. So just to take a very brief look at those in turn. Equine welfare is clearly the most important aspect of racing's social licence. If racing goes, horse race betting goes with it. And in this regard, our understanding of welfare has changed quite significantly over the last 1 to 2 decades. Many of you will be familiar with the 5 freedoms of animal welfare, which is all about the avoidance of the negative, the avoidance of pain, the avoidance of thirst, which is really important. But our understanding over the last 10 years to 20 years has shown that actually having positive experiences is as important. It's not just about giving our animals a life worth living, it's about giving them a good life. And in this regard, their mental well-being, their mental welfare is as important as their physical welfare. And in regard of social licence, it is absolutely vital to call out rule breaking. As if there is a no or minimal consequences, this can have a hugely damaging impact on the sport's social licence. And the example I often use, maybe some trepidation in this audience, is the example of Davy Russell when he was filmed punching his horse on the way to the start a few years ago. The regulator initially did nothing, there was a social media storm. The regulator did a bit more, the public didn't feel it was enough, there was another social media storm. And there was many within racing, as well as with that, who would say actually it was the way it was handled that was equally or more damaging to the sport's reputation. Secondly then, we need to consider, or maybe not, it's about ethics, ethics is all about what is right and wrong. It's about moral judgments and not scientific ones. So it's about asking, should we before can we? And this, if we can do that, we will then clearly show the values of our sport to society. And dare I say it, the use of the whip is a perfect example here. Should we be using the whip for encouragement in horse racing? I'd say to you, this is a really important ethical question, possibly more than a welfare question, because science cannot provide the total answer to this conundrum. And in this regard, WoTA's Welfare is investing in a research project at the Royal Veterinary College here in London about developing an ethical framework tool for the use in horse sport. And this will help regulators and stakeholders decide what should or should not be done in any given situation. Thirdly, we need to consider education, because we can't provide good welfare if we don't know what it looks like. So it is vital for us to keep up to date about equitation science and equine welfare, because unfortunately the goalposts do continue to move. In some sports, such as greyhound boarding here in Great Britain, continual professional development in welfare is mandatory for some stakeholders. So decision makers at all levels of the sport need to know where to find good, trustworthy, scientifically credible information and act on it. This will require changing what we do at times, challenging the status quo. Just because we've done something one way for many years doesn't necessarily make it right in today's world. And our mindset needs to be one of encouraging change and of adopting new practices where needed. And if this change is decided against, because sometimes when the public asks for it, the answer is not always to do that action, but we must be able to justify why we've made that decision. Of course, nobody will know about the good things that's going on in racing if we don't tell them. But it is pretty much impossible to do this in the face of a media crisis. Laying the groundwork during peacetime is absolutely essential. This involves promoting the welfare advances and the benefits to horses of the unique horse-human partnership within horse racing, both within the horse racing world and outside of it. But probably most important of all, you can't talk the talk unless you're going to walk the talk. Empty talk is hugely damaging to any industry's social license. And finally, out of the 5 aspects of social license, what do we mean by taking a proactive approach to this issue? This slide shows some of the examples of what some industries are doing to maintain their social license and what could be considered as best practice. Finding out the values the public holds true and espousing these is absolutely key, as this is the foundation of establishing the trust between the public and the sport. And in doing this, there may be benefits in actually inviting the wolf into the hen house. Keeping your critics sometimes close to you can be very, very beneficial. So what are racing's biggest threats? Well, research has shown that 2 of the biggest threats, visible threats, to racing's social licence are the use of the whip for the encouragement and the on-track injuries and fatalities. For sure, racing's direction of travel here on both issues is really helpful in terms of developing and enhancing the social licence. However, the speed of change may be fairly slow to a welfare-friendly public. Put another way, progress is a real positive, but it can't be an excuse for complacency. Much more can and should be done. As far as possible, we need to be proactive. We need to be ahead of the curve when tackling threats to social licence, and it is inherently difficult, not impossible, but inherently difficult to change a public view once widely established. And for any issue, we need to consider whether retaining status quo is worth the potential demise of the sport. So just to summarise, we are fortunate to be able currently, in many jurisdictions, to pursue horse racing with minimal formal restrictions. If that is to continue, we need to ensure that we treat the horse as the most important stakeholder in our sport. The public's trust is put in us to put our horses' welfare first, and their belief in the legitimacy of what we do are key to retaining our social licence and with it the future success of the sport we all love. Thank you very much.